My guest at this time is Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment and a frequent contributor to the major policy debates in Washington. As the Democratic presidential candidates debate whether to pursue a single-payer Medicare for all type healthcare system or advocate for a public option that would supposedly compete with private insurance plans, what are the real facts here? Mr. Kerpen says there really isn't much difference between the two ideas other than the speed with which the government would fully take over our healthcare system. And Phil, thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Advocates for a public option say this is a reasonable position. After all, it still allows you to keep your private insurance, so the public option would really only matter to people who want to get rid of their private coverage. You say it's just another avenue to single payer. Why?
Well, the public option was invented by a Yale professor named Jacob Hacker, and he said the logic behind it was that it was a way to transition everyone into a government-run single-payer system without the kind of political backlash that would ensue if you came out and just outright said we're going to ban private insurance and put everyone in a government plan. And the reason he said it would get us to everyone in a government plan is that the private sector really can't compete with the government at the same time that the government is taxing and regulating the private plans. It's sort of it's pretty obvious that the competitor that has the power to tax and regulate its fellow competitors will win, and it probably won't take all that long. And so this was always a way to get to the same point of eliminating private insurance and getting everyone into a government plan. And in fact, Greg, it was the exposure of this history of the idea and the strategy behind it that led to the public option not being included in Obamacare just 10 years ago. And yet we have many Democrats in the media now who want us to act as if we don't know what the purpose of that public option is, and that it actually takes us to the exact same place as where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want us to be, with everyone in a government plan.
Get a little more specific on how this would work in terms of pushing private insurance coverage out of the market. Would it just be that the government can always lowball the premium and it forces the private insurers to jack everything up to the point where no one can afford it anymore?
Well, there are multiple mechanisms that would advantage a government plan over private insurance in that kind of a system. Well, one, of course, is the ability of the government to dictate prices to hospitals and doctors by saying, essentially, if you don't take the public option, the Medicare for all plan, whatever they call it, if you don't accept that, then you'll lose access to Medicaid, Medicare, VA, TRICARE, whatever. And the purchasing power of the federal government essentially makes them a price maker. And typically, when doctors and hospitals are forced to accept below market prices from government insurers, what they do to try to make up for it is charge more on the private insurance side. So we would see that turned up, that aspect of our current system, we would see that exacerbated in a system where Medicare or a government public option is opened up to everyone. The people in that plan would be systematically underpaying doctors and hospitals, which would force upward price pressure on the private plan, which would make it even more difficult for them to compete, as well as I mentioned, the private plans have to deal with regulatory compliance and they've got to pay taxes, neither of which is an issue for a government-run plan. And so there are systematic advantages that are inherent in a public plan, a government-run plan, relative to private plans. There's no way you would ever have a level or a fair competition between the two.
Phil, you mentioned it probably wouldn't take long to morph from public option to single payer. You talking a few years, couple of decades? What do you think?
Well, that part is a little bit harder to predict, but I will say that if you look at what's happened just over the past decade, from all of the Democrats saying, how dare you say we want socialized medicine, Obamacare has nothing to do with that, we would never force anyone into a government plan. Now, that was 10 years ago. Where we are now, about half of the Democrats now openly say, yeah, single payer, ban private insurance, stick everyone in a government plan. And so the evolution has happened pretty rapidly, and I think that if they had that next step of everyone can join a government plan if they want to, it would be a pretty short hop from there to eliminating the private plans and having everyone in the government plan. So I don't know the answer in terms of a number of years, but I think it could happen fairly quickly.
We're talking with Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment. And Phil, this brings us back to the Obamacare debate in another way from a decade ago, where the insurance industry loved Obamacare because they saw the individual mandate coming. Everybody's got to buy insurance, so they loved that fact, even while the president was still pitching the public option, which if you knew that this is where the public option would lead us, they had to know that too. So how did they not see this coming?
Well, they did. They played a very cynical double game. What the insurance industry did through the Obamacare debate is they funded, $50 or $100 million of pro-Obamacare ads under their own names through their trade association, America's Health Insurance Plan, saying how wonderful Obamacare was. And then at the same time, they spent about $100 million through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce opposing a public option and arguing, public option's terrible, it'll destroy healthcare, all the sorts of arguments. And so they really tried to play both sides to calibrate the outcome, and they ended up getting basically exactly what they wanted. Everyone was required to buy their product or pay a penalty tax, and they did not have that public option that would over time eliminate it. So they got, in a sense, exactly what they wanted. The problem for them is that it really didn't work very well. And so it didn't really solve any of the problems with healthcare that people have in this country, and that's why they're now so squarely in the crosshairs again.
Oh, that two-faced approach is exactly why so many people hate Washington. But at least the Democrats know what their two different approaches are here. Do Republicans have a coherent, specific counterproposal yet?
I think there's a pretty good consensus among Republicans and conservatives about how to approach health care for the first time in a very long time. And the consensus emerged late in 2017, unfortunately a little too late to pass a bill because they were up against the deadline at the end of September. Thad Cochran had health problems. They were never able to come to the floor. But the insight that I think is where Republicans are right now is we're not going to agree on a one-size-fits-all national reform approach to health care that deals with the whole thing comprehensively. There are too many different ideas, too many different approaches, but what we can agree on is Washington is the wrong place for all of this money and power to be, the wrong place to try to solve the health care problem. So I think the consensus, to the extent there is one, is to punt to the states, to basically send all of the money and all of the regulatory power to the 50 state capitals. And, while that is not much relief for people in places like California and New York that are never going to do anything helpful, it would mean that in more conservative states, they would be able to move in a really free market direction with more choice and more competition, people being able to control their own health care dollars, and maybe the people who are commercially uninsurable being dealt with separately, being provided adequate subsidies so they would still have coverage with pre-existing conditions and so forth, but without driving up costs for everyone else. And there are lots of different models and ideas about how to do that. That's where it gets more difficult to get consensus. But I think on the federal piece of it, if President Trump is reelected and Republicans recapture the House of Representatives, it's very likely that we would see this kind of block grant approach to get all the money and power out of Washington. And then, of course, the burden would be on the state capitals. And the hope would be that you get at least a few states that would really get it right and would then serve as the model for others.
Phil, this is a critical issue with a lot of different layers, and it's obviously going to be a very big part of the 2020 campaign. If you want to read more about Phil's views on how the public option is really just another avenue to single payer, he's written an op-ed which you can find at the American Commitment website. Phil, thanks again very much for your time today.
My pleasure, Greg. Have a good one.
Thank you, sir. Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.